we got it. Yay.
Yeah,
Now
I'll
we
have to
just
look into that later. Apologies.
now we just have to pray to God that the storm doesn't take his power, okay?
There are heroes.
So Mr. Hakim, could you please as you just were telling me a few minutes ago, could you please mention, like you were saying, this is a very vast subject, too large to include in an hour and a half, you said, right? Was it?
That is correct. That is correct. This is one of those topics that you do not come across many people discussing it, because by many it is considered to be a can of worm. And sometimes people do not want to get into the nitty gritties of the concept of freedom. And on the other hand, it's an extremely emotional topic, particularly for people, who live in the United States. That is one of the issues that people sometimes have problem, conversing about it. Um, it is, in my opinion, an hour and a half is not going to be adequate in covering this particular topic. So please take this presentation to be an introduction, and hopefully something that is going to whet people's appetites for uh, exploring it further. Uh, that's all I can say. It's just covering 30 foils in about an hour and a half with dense amount of material and ranging from various issues, from knowledge to all the way to various philosophical concepts of life, is not something that you can really do justice in an hour and a half. But in any case, we will try. We will try.
That makes a lot of sense. So for everyone who's joining us, this is going to be a huge subject. We're going to be making the presentation available so people can use it as means to not just investigate themselves, but to hopefully use and search more effectively as they're trying to search for what deeper pathways these doors lead to. We'll call it that, right?
Yep.
Gateways to knowledge. So hello everybody, this is John, and we have from the Clearwater Baha'i community event that we always host every Sunday, Baha'i Explorations with Dr. Hakim, Mr. Kamran Hakim. Sorry. You're smart to me, smart enough to be a doctor in practically Baha'i studies as well. So this is we're very, very happy to have you here today. So I'm going to give it a short introduction, and then we'll get back to the subject of freedom is and freedom is not. Mr. Hakim has been married for 37 years. He has 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Mr. Hakim currently lives in Northborough, Massachusetts. Kamran Hakim and his wife are members of the Worcester Baha'i community. Mr. Hakim was born into a Baha'i family, and his religious ancestry is from Jewish descent on his father's side, and on his mother's side, he is of Muslim descent. Mr. Hakim does not consider himself to be a Baha'i by birth. Mr. Hakim declared himself a Baha'i through his own investigation after he moved to the United States in 1976 for continuing his education. Being away from his family provided Mr. Hakim the opportunity to examine his beliefs. He explored the Baha'i faith along with other religions and ideologies before he chose the Baha'i faith in his spiritual path. Mr. Hakim has a master's degree in materials science and engineering from State University of New York at Stony Brook, Long Island, New York. Mr. Hakim is a device reliability engineer by profession. Over the past 4 decades, philosophical writings and scriptures of various religions have continued to attract Mr. Hakim's attention. He has continued to explore them both as his hobby. Given his professional background, Naturally, Mr. Hakim likes to look at religion and philosophy from an engineering perspective. Some have characterized this approach as the more comprehensive epistemological perspective. Mr. Hakim's presentation should therefore be considered in this light. Mr. Hakim was very active in various Usenet groups from 1982 to 1992, then to a lesser extent from 1993 to 1998, through private communication with various people throughout the world. Mr. Hakim has worked on deep diving into the Baha'i writings with several groups of youth, ages 13 to 18, over the past 2 decades. With that said, we are going to talk about today, freedom is and freedom is not. And the purpose of this presentation is to explore the philosophical implications of this concept from a Baha'i point of view. So, Mr. Hakim, it's all yours.
Thank you. So please allow me to share. Okay, the concept that we are going to be talking about today is freedom. It suffices to say that this is going to be an extremely emotional topic for many. And in my opinion, it is a topic that is already either not discussed enough and in many cases is a misunderstood concept. Yet nevertheless, everyone has very strong feelings about it. Hopefully we can explore some introductory ideas in this presentation, and my hopes are that you walk away with more questions rather than having an aha moment and say, okay, that's what I need to understand. We really need to start questioning these things. That's my purpose. In the beginning, I would like to just start in the first 2 pages to put a framework in what freedom means in the American context. So basically, this is a quotation for which you have a reference and you can refer to it. It says that freedom is more complicated than being able to do whatever one desires. Taken too far, that approach would lead to dangerous anarchy and every person for themselves. Certainly, freedom can mean the right to do, think, believe, speak, worship, gather, or act as one pleases, but only until your choices start to infringe on another person's freedom. I felt that this is a very important quote to start with because great majority of us live in the United States and people can relate to this. Hold on. So, just hold on a second. I need to go. All right. So, according to the Constitution of the United States, and particularly the First Amendment, we have been granted freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, as well as freedom of petition. However, even though we live under the Constitution, and we have all these freedoms, yet if we start thinking about it, we will see that the freedoms that we have are limited. And there are multiple examples of that, and I have provided a few of them here. For example, my freedoms are limited by the laws of the land. A very important example of that are the laws of the traffic. I cannot do anything that I want when I get into my car because I'm gonna bound to hit someone or get into an accident. So as a result, my freedoms are guaranteed as long as I follow those laws. According to the rules that govern medicine, basically, if I attempt suicide, my freedoms are going to be taken away in order to protect my life. So I'm not free to do what I want. Also, if I am going to exercise my free speech, and I am going to go to a crowded theater and shout fire just for the heck of it, basically, according to the Supreme Court decision, this is not really kosher, and I cannot do that. This is an abuse of my freedom of speech because it's going to cause a stampede and people are going to get hurt. And there are a number of other examples of this, and I'm going to offer you probably a couple of other ones. Even though we have freedom of religion, and that is identified here, however, if you really think about it, you and I do not have freedom of religion, because if I was born as Kamran Hakim in India, chances are that I would have been a Hindu or a Buddhist. If I was born in a Muslim country, let's say such as Saudi Arabia, chances are that I would have been a Muslim, because that is a part and parcel of the family structure and the other sets of issues that are associated with human beings, that you become whatever your family is and wherever they are. In some countries, you cannot marry who you want. Your marriage is predetermined at birth. In some places, for example, you are going to end up doing the type of work that your father did, and you're not allowed to do anything else. In some cases, you are bound in a caste system and you cannot get out of that caste that you were born into. So this etc. and etc. that I have here, there are many, many examples of this that I can discuss here ad nauseum. And I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what it is that we are dealing with here and what type of problems there are. So how far can I take my freedoms and retain a healthy balance between my freedom and those of others? That was discussed in the previous sheet. So my goals and objectives in this presentation are as follows: to explore the multifaceted characteristics of freedom, hopefully show a relationship between freedom and action, to evaluate the relationship between the actions we take and one's level of understanding, and also to show the nature of the inputs that we use which influence our understanding, to explore the difference between observation, information, knowledge, and wisdom and how they impact our actions, to show observation and information do not provide enough understanding to act upon, and demonstrate that knowledge and wisdom are indeed actionable things that we need to consider. Also to explain how knowledge defines one's worldviews, to suggest that common sense cannot be relied upon, and to provide a simple and robust way for achieving knowledge-based decision. If you walk away from this discussion understanding this particular point that I'm making in number 10, I think I have been able to provide a good framework for you, because in my opinion, one of the fundamental problems that we have is the decisions that we make based on our freedom that are not knowledge-based. And this formula that is described here, and this formula is provided by Abdul Baha, I believe is probably one of the most fascinating things that a person could explore. And in the future, we are going to have probably many PhD thesis written about this particular way that I'm going to be discussing here. And last but not the least, advocate freedom as a multifaceted human right, which must be exercised in moderation. I want everyone to understand that this is my intentions here are to provide a philosophical presentation, not a political one. However, depending on what the political tendencies of a particular person is, they can read into a philosophical presentation and say this fellow has this type of political orientation. I just want to clarify that this is purely a philosophical presentation. Hold on a second. Okay, please pay attention to this particular table here. Don't try to read through the material that's there. In the conversations that I had with a couple of other people when I put this presentation together, one of the issues that was pointed out was the amount of verbiage in each page is too high. I did not want to walk away from that because I felt that this material is going to be staying on the internet, on the site, and I wanted it to be self-explanatory by itself without people listening to the explanation that I'm providing. So that's the reason that you see all the explanation in there. It was put in there for a purpose, not for your sake, but for the sake of those people who are going to be reading this as a standalone document. So please pay attention to the table here. There is a type of system that is used. It is called a taxonomy, a taxonomic system, where life has been broken up into basically three categories of mineral, vegetable, and animal. And we'll find that Abdu'l-Baha added a fourth category to that, which is the human kingdom to that. And basically, in this taxonomic approach, certain characteristics have been attributed to various kingdoms. So for instance, in the mineral kingdom, please look at this definition of life: atomic and molecular rearrangements resulting in different forms and compositions. So life is defined by molecular rearrangement and atomic rearrangement. When we go to the vegetable kingdom, in addition to atomic and molecular rearrangement, which is shifted over from the lower kingdom, in the vegetable kingdom, we'll see food consumption, augmentation, and reproduction, which are specific to this particular kingdom. When you go to the animal kingdom, it has all the characteristics of the lower kingdoms, in addition to willful movement and sense perception. And then later on, Abdu'l-Baha, all the philosophers and scientists of the 18th and the 19th century basically believed that a human being is a part and parcel of the animal kingdom. So basically, this taxonomic categorization really was made out of these three. Abdu'l-Baha added the fourth one to it, and he said that a human being is differentiated from the animal by the power of intellectual investigation, and as well as the free will in its psychological implications. So having said that, now I am going to describe concept of freedom and associate that with the definition of life here. So please pay attention to this particular type of part of the table. So when we are talking about mineral life being defined as atomic and molecular rearrangement, when we look at life, we will see that these atomic and molecular rearrangements are happening freely throughout nature. That's why we have got multifaceted range of various components, compounds throughout the world. For example, iron goes to iron oxide, different forms of it, FeO, Fe2O3, and Fe3O4, and these are happening freely. When you look at the vegetable kingdom, you will find that vegetables, grass, for example, grows freely throughout nature. And consumption of food from the ground, growing and reproducing, is a free thing that is a part and parcel of nature. Animals move freely around without being forced to do so. And they perceive life by the virtue of sense perception. And all these things are done freely. If we consider human beings, let's say, as a part and parcel of the rest of the nature, naturally they should have freedom appearing in different forms and composition. Like the rest of the creation, they should be able to freely consume, grow, and reproduce like the rest of the nature. They should be able to freely move around, perceive life by the virtue of sense perception like the rest of the nature, and also freely exercise one's intellects and desires like the rest of the nature. However, there is a catch here. Human beings have imposed their will on the rest of the nature, so as a result, they have taken away all this freedom of themselves and the rest of the nature. And that is the topic of our conversation here. So Abdu'l-Baha makes an interesting point that a human being is above and beyond nature. It's not a part of nature. And as a result, should be treated separately. And one of the fundamental arguments that he offers is that basically human beings have been able to take the sword out of the hands of nature and be able, through the power of intellect, and be able to take the rules of nature to their own benefit and be able to do that which they have accomplished throughout the ages. So having said that, now we are going to focus a little bit on the concept of freedom. And I would like to consider a philosophical triad here in order to explore this notion of freedom. In philosophy, God does what God wills. A human being does what a human being desires. An animal does what animal can do. Please note that in all cases, there is a freedom implied by the action that is taken. God is free to do what God wills. Human is free to do what human desires. An animal is free to do what animal can do. And the reason that one animal has been characterized as such is because animal is captive of nature, and nature places the boundaries around that which animal can do. Now, I want to point out here that this notion of God that I'm talking about here has nothing to do with religion. This is a philosophical notion of God. It is simply an extrapolation of the intellectual premise that if there are many different forms of life below human life, there must be other forms above it, ultimate form being God. So if you look at the philosophical writings of Greeks, you will find that the concept of God has been discussed. There is quite a bit of conversation happening between Christians and people who read Plato's Republic and other writings of the philosophers, and they are trying to advocate that it is the same God and so on and so forth. I just want you to focus on the idea that philosophers such as Aristotle, such as Plato, and such as Socrates also had a notion of God embedded in their philosophy, and we are purely looking at it from a philosophical point of view here. I also want you to understand the difference between will and desire. Will is the ability to decide and commit to something and take a particular action in order to come up with a certain outcome. However, desire is nothing more than a longing and hoping for an outcome. Man decided that and hoped for flying. And as a result of that desire, our intellectual abilities allowed us to be able to achieve that desire later on. However, when you get to the difference between a willful choice and desire, I have explained it here. A willful choice and desire is that we might desire something, for example, desire to have a meaningful beliefs by rejecting our inherited religious beliefs. However, we might not be willing to independently investigate the truth. So as a result, people have not accepted the religions that have appeared successively in the educational system that was provided to us throughout the ages. So as a result, a Jew remained a Jew, a Christian remained a Christian, a Muslim remained a Muslim. And Baha'is are attempting to point out that there was a reason that we had multiple religions. So people need to figure out and find the balance between the willful choice and the desire. Abdu'l-Baha states that the path of nature is the path of the animal realm. So have that in mind as we discuss the rest of this. So human freedom is going to be closely tied to that which human beings desire. This is extremely important. Please remember that. I just want to point out here, your focus should not be on the rest of this table. Your focus should be on the last column of this table, which is the examples of the lower levels of freedom in higher forms of life. So look at these various forms of freedoms that we are talking about. These various forms of freedoms in the mineral kingdom, they appear in different chemicals and different material that have different chemical characteristics and material properties. Iron has a different material property than copper. Copper has a different material property and physical properties than a stone. And for example, all of those have different chemical properties than other material that exist in the mineral kingdom, such as uranium, for example. If uranium has the ability to provide us with extreme levels of power from which we can generate electricity and all sorts of other things. So when you go to the other kingdoms, these are the different forms of freedoms that are provided to us. For example, I'm just going to give you one example because I'm spending too much time on these foils. So take this mineral freedom, and I'm going to superimpose that into the human kingdom because we still have that same mineral freedom in our life. So the human freely appears in different colors and looks or forms, in different abilities or characters throughout nature. So for example, we appear with various colors of skin, we appear in different heights, we appear in different shapes. Now please note that all of these are things that are happening freely in nature. However, we impose our desire upon these freedoms, and we call a particular race of a particular color to be inferior to the rest. So you see, we are taking the most fundamental form of freedom, and at the level of human, we are turning it into something against another human being because of the virtue of the color they have, or the size of their body, or the shape of their body, whether they are short or tall, or so on and so forth. So one point to talk about here, given the fact that we're talking about human desire and all these things that are happening in the human world has to do with human desire, I want to take you to the field of psychology. In the field of psychology, there is a fundamental assumption that was made that human being is basically an animal in nature. As a result, if human is an animal, then by studying animals, we can learn about humans. Is that a problem? At the end of the day, we have been able to take a lot of benefit from this particular assumption. However, when we get to the realm of human behavior, the question becomes, are we going to choose the animal as a model of our behavior, or are we going to choose something else as a model of our behavior? There is no problem with looking at the animal body and try to, from a physical point of view, try to come up with solution to our physical problems. How about the intellectual problems? How about problems that have to do with human behavior? Is it correct for us to use animal as that model? The problem is that sense perception is going to regulate the animal world, and animal is driven by its instincts. Now, God forbid, you try to put intelligence on the top of this, the intelligence of a human being, and all of a sudden the door is wide open for all sorts of abuses. And how are we going to deal with that? So one might ask, among human desires, which ones are worthy of the human station and which ones are not? So naturally, this is going to bring us to a point where, what is the human station? And I'm going to share with you a couple of quotations from the Baha'i writings. The first one is from Baha'u'llah. He says, upon the inmost reality of each and every created being, he has shed the light of one of his names and made it the recipient of the glory of one of his attributes. Upon the reality of man, however, he has focused the radiance of all his names and attributes and made it the mirror of his own self. Alone of all created things, man has been singled out for so great a favor and so enduring a bounty. And then later on, he goes on to say, man is the supreme talisman Lack of proper education hath, however, deprived him of that which he doth inherently possess. Regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable values. Education alone can cause it to reveal its treasures and enable mankind to benefit therefrom. Please note that there are some cases that I have underlined and highlighted in bold. Those are my own. The Baha'i text does not come with this type of underlining or the bolding, so please have that in mind when you're taking a look at this. So we just went through some of the basic, this was basically an introduction to my presentation. And please accept my apologies for such a long-winded presentation. However, I am a firm believer that if you are going to start a building, the best place to start is the foundation. If you have a foundation on sand, that building is going to fall. That's what Jesus Christ said. So the question is, how firmly are we going to lay that foundation in order to be able to build something on that? So please bear with me and excuse my long-windedness here. So here I am providing a bunch of definitions here. I am not going to go through all these definitions. You can go to a dictionary and you can find every one of these. I am, however, going to point to something. I am going to be making a differentiation between the concept of freedom to do something and freedom of something, and in contrast to a different concept that I am going to refer to later on as freedom from something. And we will discuss that later on. However, if we go through all these definitions, and this is not by all means an all-inclusive list, you're going to come up probably with more definitions there. However, among all the definitions that you come across, there is some unique similarity among all of them, and that is that there is someone or something impacting our freedom. It is others can jail us or enslave us. Despotic governments, they are going to take away our freedoms. Foreign domination limiting our freedoms. Laws of the nature limiting our freedoms, etc., etc., and etc. But the question is that the most important thing? And I'm going to let you in on a secret. That is not. This is by far the least important aspect of freedom. So how do these definitions relate to various forms of freedom? I have taken, and please take a look at this part of the table, not the rest of it. We have already discussed those. In the definition of freedom that we discussed in the previous page, I have attempted to map that into these various forms of freedom that come from these other kingdoms. So for example,
just to clarify, you mean on the right side in blue where it says definitions of human freedom mapped into various kingdoms?
That is correct. That is correct.
Okay.
So
the no one has any questions.
So the definitions of human freedom that we had in the previous page, I have mapped those into these types of freedoms that we are seeing in this column, and I have posted them here on the right-hand side. And I chose these as specific colors, not for just for this to be beautiful. This is not for your eyes' pleasures. This was made to make a distinction of the types of freedoms that are related to these particular different kingdoms. So for example, I want to highlight something here, that when in the definitions of freedom, we are talking about the state of being free from slavery. I want you to understand that this is something that is related to one of the most fundamental characteristics of nature, which is the mineral kingdom, where things of different forms are to be free by nature in order to be able to express themselves. The color of the skin is one of the variations of forms in the human kingdom that in reality was defined with the mineral kingdom. And in mineral kingdom, we find that freedom to be abundantly available. The only thing that prevents it are the laws of nature. However, in human kingdom, thanks to our desires or our animalistic desires, we have taken the person with a different color of skin and we have enslaved them in order to serve our purpose. We have taken, for example, women to be inferior to the more powerful patriarchal men. So as a result, once again, you see, I'm giving you one example of this because we don't have time to go through all of them. So you can see that this is probably one of the most fundamental forms of freedom in nature. And we have even taken that away from our fellow citizens. So having said that, I'm going to just go through some of these observations here, that some of these dictionary definitions of freedom relate to lower forms of freedom. I gave you a couple of examples here. The color code corresponds to those different kingdoms. Even intellectual forms of freedoms that are in danger of being tied to the issues that are related to lower forms of life. Be aware of that. I'm going to give you another example, suppressing reproduction. You go throughout the world, you find that various governments have experimented with the idea, for example, in China, Vietnam, Singapore, even in Iran, various forms of suppression of reproduction has been either recommended, prescribed, or it has been enforced. For example, in China, there was a time that they had a one-child policy, and then later on they had a two-child policy, and people could not but to follow that. Other than that, they would have lost a lot of things. Separation of form, for example, corresponds to racism. Separation of composition corresponds to classism. And all of these belong to the lowest forms of freedom. So the question is, how do we attain to higher forms of freedom? What kind of freedom would be worthy of the human station as the supreme talisman? What do our children understand about the notion of freedom? And how are we going to educate them about freedom so that they become more capable contributors of the society? Now, before I get to some of the characteristics of freedom, we just completed the introduction to freedom that I was talking about. One thing that I want to say is that with all these definitions of freedom and so on and so forth, I was attempting to point out that they are very superficial. And I'm going to point out why I consider them superficial. I am not attempting to put down any of the dictionaries or anything that the leaders of thought have said. However, I want to bring one particular point to your attention. When a child looks at the sky and looks at the concept of daylight and nighttime and looks at the movement of the sun across the sky, the very first impression that child has is the fact that sun is moving from the east and going to the west. This is why that we are referring to two terms, sunrise and sunset. The action is attributed to the sun. So Tom, Dick, and Harry, everybody with their brothers and sisters, they can look at the sky, they look at the heavens, and they can make that judgment that the sun is moving. However, after a while, we figured out that when we superimpose our intellectual capability on the concept, we determine that it is the earth that is turning around itself. It is not the sun that is moving. The same thing I want to point out about the freedom. These superficial definitions that you're seeing, that Tom, Dick, and Harry are talking about it, and they find it in the dictionary, is the basic sensible understanding of what freedom is. There are far more and far deeper meanings associated with freedom that comes about as a result of superimposing your intellectual understanding upon this concept. Once again, please accept my apologies for spending so much time on the introduction. Once again, the foundation is extremely important. So I'm going to discuss some basic characteristics of freedom and do some deep dive on each one of them. As we explore freedom, we are going to find out that freedom is a relative phenomenon. It's not an absolute one. The notion of freedom is understood differently by different individuals. We need to standardize this. Given the fact that we live in a society, it's extremely important. There are less obvious factors than someone or something impacting our freedom. This is extremely important. Please pay attention to this. These days, it is one of the pet statements that are made by our politicians. As soon as they get on TV, they say other people are after taking away our freedoms. This is the name of the game. And everybody with their brothers and sisters come up with arms, try to see how they can protect that. That is one of the most childish statements that someone could be making. Actually, if you hear something like that, you should turn off the TV, because the person who is saying it has no idea what freedom is. It is like the person who is trying to tell you that the sun is moving from the east to the west. Please remember that analogy that I gave you when you come across a statement like this. The notion of freedom is intimately tied with the ability to act, and these actions range from thinking to speaking, from choosing to doing. Effort is necessary requirement for knowledge-based action. Information age that we are living in, the challenges it has introduced into this whole concept. We are going to have some discussion about that. There are some problems associated with the worlds of knowledge, and I'm going to discuss that. And also, I'm going to propose a method for having a knowledge-based decision-making process without a need for being a scholar. So freedom is a relative phenomenon. Understanding takes place relative to that which is already understood. You cannot understand anything if there is nothing in your mind that you can relate the new topic to. It is an extremely important thing to remember. This is a fundamental philosophical assumption, remains to be always true. You always understand things relative to that which you have already understood. Another factor is that there are many cases where we understand a concept by its opposite. I've given some examples of that. Wealth is understood by poverty. Poverty is understood by wealth. Ignorance is understood by knowledge. Knowledge is understood by ignorance, because ignorance is the absence of knowledge. Dark is the absence of light. Cold is the absence of heat. So without one, the other one cannot be understood. Abdu'l-Baha has provided detailed explanation of this in some answered questions. I highly recommend that you explore that. Furthermore, it is important to point out that it is the positive attribute which has reality. The negative one does not have reality. It does exist. However, it does not have reality. For example, to give you an example, when we talk about wealth, that means someone has something that they can do something with. If you take away that, that means they are not going to be able to do anything, and that is the state of poverty. When you're in a state of poverty, you do not have the means to do that which you can do when you're in a state of wealth. The same thing is true about knowledge. The same thing is true about light. In the case of light, for example, these are energetic photons that are producing the effect that we call light. You take away the energetic photons, dark becomes the name of the game, right? And heat is generally the outcome of the movement that is occurring at the atomic level or at the molecular level. If you take that away, basically cold is going to be the nothingness, is the outcome of the nothingness that's there. So once again, explanation of this comes right out of some answered questions. I highly recommend you refer to that book. I am going to suggest that the same thing is true about freedom. Without captivity, confinement, restriction, etc., one cannot have a wholesome understanding of freedom. Abdu'l-Baha actually refers to this specifically. He is referring to his own incarceration and his own imprisonment in this human world, there is no greater blessing than liberty. I, for 40 years, have been a prisoner. I do know the value and blessing of liberty. Is there a greater blessing than this? Freedom, liberty, and security. Now, this thing, I really want you to think about this. We come across a lot of these concepts that I just explained here. Freedom is just what we are talking about here. I'm going to give you an example of something like racism or prejudice against the black race or other races. You and I could sit around as people who are not in that particular situation and can have make some type of a statement in regards to what that problem is. However, we cannot possibly have an understanding of that until we have experienced that. If you really truly want to understand what racial prejudice is, you need to talk to a black person. If you really need to understand what poverty is, the majority of us are very comfortable in our lives. If you really want to understand what poverty is, go and hang around with a person who lives in poverty. Go and observe them in order to understand it. Because understanding comes as a result of being able to compare that which you have versus that which you do not have. You need to experience that. So, to complete the concept of relativity or the relative nature of freedom, I am going to walk you through an experiment here. We are going to define a world of one. And let's say Kamran is the only citizen of this world. So I live on planet Earth. There is nobody else. So what does that mean in regards to my freedom? I am free to do whatever it is that I want to do. And I mean that. I can do whatever it is that I want to do. I can carry guns. I can basically go and do whatever that I want to do. There are too many examples to give. However, there is a caveat in there. As long as I do not violate the laws of nature, I can do whatever it is that I want to do. Now, let's say we are going to change this world and we are going to make it a world of two. Now, there is a story in the Bible that is reminiscent of that. When God created Adam and then created Eve, that is the representation of a world of two. Now, we are not going to talk about what is the meaning of the story of Adam and Eve. I'm just using it as an example here. I don't care about the theological implication, what Christians, Jews, Muslims, or whoever else believes in it. It's just an example. I'm using it as an example alone. So in a world of two, when the two are married without children, freedom is going to find meaning in the context of us as a couple. I cannot do that which defies the freedoms of my better half. Otherwise, she's going to make my life miserable. And the same is true about the other person. If the other person is going to take away my freedoms, then I might end up to make life miserable for her. Now you might say, Kamran, why are you saying that? Just look at the statistics. 50% of the marriages in the United States are ending up in divorce. This is the reason, because everybody thinks that they can have the freedoms of one individual as the only person in the world, and they carry it with them into their marriage. And they want to exercise that. And hallelujah and praise the Lord, they are going to find out that that is an impossibility, because it is not going to work. They are going to be free in the context of the needs of the other person. Now, granted that if the two of them are apart from one another, yes, they are married, but somehow or the other, the events have dictated that they're going to be far away from each other, where they can act alone. Yes, the freedoms that we discussed in number 1 become activated. However, when the two are together, this is extremely important to remember the freedom with the two. Now let's make this a family, married with children. When the children come, parents cannot do what it is that they want to do. They need to consider the needs of the children. And that is when the freedom is going to become more meaningful. Then we take it to the level of tribe. This is many families who are related to one another. Once again, freedom is going to be defined in its tribal sense. At the level of a nation, many unrelated tribes, freedom is going to find its meaning in the context of its national, with its national implications. And now we are entering into a global village where people are from multiple countries. They look different, they speak different, they have different monetary systems, they have different economies, and so on and so forth. Now the question becomes, how is freedom going to be defined in a world like that? Naturally, it needs to be defined in the context of us as a world. Now, one thing that I want you to walk away with this is that as we go from the world of one to a world composed of multiple countries, many unrelated nations and races, ethnicities, languages, and so on and so forth, the meaning of freedom becomes more restricted. Now, when people talk about restrictions, they start shivering because they say, ooh, I should be free to do whatever I want. But that's not how it is. If you are in a world of one, yes, you can do whatever you want. However, you see, as you're going from here to here, you are superimposing a lot of restrictions on that which you can do. And these restrictions come by the virtue of the laws that we impose at the town level, city level, country level, international level, and so on and so forth. I had given you an example about the laws of traffic, and please consider that. I've given some examples here. I'm not going to go through that. You can read through it for yourself.
Mr. Hakim, speaking of some freedoms, your face is freely outside of the screen. If we could,
Am I inside now?
It's better now. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the presentation, so I cannot look at myself. So sorry about that. Please accept my apologies. Some observations about the relative natures of freedom. Examples provided in cases 1 to 6. This is basically what I'm referring to. 1 to 6 are here, right? So clearly display a relative nature of human freedom. Human life is dynamic. It is multidimensional. That means that our understanding of freedom cannot be static. As I go from a single person to a married person, to a family person, to a person who is going to act as a brother, as a father, as a grandfather, as a leader, as a manager, or whoever else. There are going to be different definitions of freedom that are going to become available to me, and I need to use them. So you're not going to be using a single definition of freedom in every aspect of your life. Also, we need to understand that freedom is a dynamic relative phenomenon. As a dynamic relative phenomenon is not intuitively acquired. You cannot just say that I am just going to, I am born and I'm left alone to go on beach, comb the beach, and be happy and say Hakuna Matata, and I am 60 years old now, and I have a good understanding of what freedom is. Freedom, like anything else in life, is going to require being educated about. And the first education should come from parents. The next set of education should come from schools, and it should be done from early childhood, and it's going to continue throughout the university education. And this is something that should be a part and parcel of our education throughout our lives until the day that we are alive. Once again, there is an increasing measure of natural restriction that gets incorporated into one's freedom as one shifts from solitary life in Alaskan wilderness, for example, toward living in a socially contributing American in Manhattan, for example. These restrictions arise from interaction between individual freedoms and freedoms of others. And these interactions must result in a natural moderation of the lower level freedoms. So this is the point that I'm attempting to make here. So I have a lot of freedom when I am the only person in the world. When another person enters into my life as the love of my life, and we decide to get married and to live together as a couple, as a husband and wife, then my freedoms and her freedoms have to be moderated relative to one another in order to come up with the freedom that regulates our life as a couple. And you can apply the same principle basically up to level 6 here. So a new definition of freedom, above and beyond the existing definition, being free implies my understanding of how I can exercise my freedom in various social contexts without infringing on others' freedom. Now, I am referring to as a new definition of freedom because I want to capture your attention. I mean, clearly this was a part and parcel of the very original definition that I provided. However, when we start understanding the nitty-gritties of freedom, then we should start exploring what these things mean. That's the reason that I'm calling it a new definition. So having said that, I also described that we are going to need to standardize the definition of freedom. I don't know how many people have gone to Stockholm. If you ever go there, there is a very interesting museum in there. And they have this baby that they just pulled out of water. This was a warship that they built. And somehow or the other, the king decided that in order to build this ship and bring capable people from 2 different places, bring Swedish people and as well as people from Amsterdam to do the work. However, given the fact that they couldn't work together, so he gave the task to half of them to work on half of the ship and one half to work on the other half of the ship. Now, it turns out that on its maiden voyage, this thing just went underwater. It was so heavy and it was not stable. And people were scratching their head. What the hell? How come such an ingenious design, which comes from such people who have so much experience in shipbuilding, how come this thing could not last? And it's just went underwater. And it turns out that the size of the Swedish feet was different from the Amsterdam feet. One of them was 11 inches, the other one was 12 inches. So some of our thinkers decided that, oh, we have to start standardizing the concept of a linear foot. We need to settle down and say that this is how many inches it's going to be. We cannot just put our foot down and say that that is the size of the foot, because then all of our ships are going to go underwater. The same thing is true about freedom. The way Kamran understands freedom from the way Jack understands freedom and Jill understands freedom are going to be different. And if we are to interact together in the society, we need to be able to have a similar understanding of what the fundamental assumptions are in freedom. Otherwise, one of us is going to have an 11-inch type of a freedom, the other one 12-inch of a freedom, and they are not going to make sense, and they are not going to work out. So this concept of freedom from, I pulled this concept basically from the Baha'i writings here, and there are a number of quotations here that I want to attract your attention to. You see, sometimes we can easily become captivated by the world of nature, and by doing so, we are going to enslave ourselves. There are a few quotations that I've put in here. And Baha'u'llah, according to Abdul Baha, he says that among the teachings of Baha'u'llah, man's freedom, that through ideal power should be emancipated and free from the captivity of the world of nature. This is extremely important. This is basically the core of the concept of freedom. If we do not have this, it is as if we look at the sun in the sky and say the sun is rising from the east and going to the west. If you understand that we can become captive of the world of nature, then the rest of the definitions that have been offered about freedom are going to start becoming far more meaningful. So this is the reason that this is at the core. This is a core level definition that we need to understand. He further states that let us turn our hearts away from the world of matter and live in the spiritual world. It alone can give us freedom. Now, I'm not going to get into what does it mean to live in a spiritual world here. I'm going to leave that to you guys to go and explore for yourselves. However, don't take the meaning of a spiritual world in a what we understand from it in the context of historical religious teachings, because that takes away from what the true meaning of a spiritual world is. He also points out that there is a rebirth that is required. And this concept of rebirth appears in many different scriptures, and people are associating it with some very strange phenomenon, which I do not want to discuss here. However, this rebirth is basically our ability to separate ourselves from the world of nature. And it's an extremely profound concept. Once again, I'm not going to go into details for this. You can do your own research and figure out what he taught about this. Another factor that's important is freedom from oneself. Sometimes we can become, if a human being becomes the center of the universe, I become selfish enough that everything should be done in order to serve my needs, then we are going to be in a very bad position. Just open up your eyes, look around you. There are ample examples of this in the world today, where individuals have become the centers of the world, and they are causing quite a bit of problems in the world that we live in. Another factor is by my own choice, I can enslave myself. So if I decide to use drugs and I become addicted, through my addiction, I am basically taking away a lot of freedoms that I could potentially have. By deciding against becoming educated throughout the time frame where education should be mandatory for me, I can limit my freedoms later on in life. To give you one example, I have a lot of respect for a person who go and gets their PhD in some field of endeavor which they like. However, later on in their life, they decide that they want to go and comb the beach. You see, they are going to have, at the point that they are going to make that choice, the fact that they are educated also provide them with the opportunity to do a lot of other things in addition to combing the beach. However, consider a child who from childhood decides that I am going to go and have a good time. I'm going to go to the beach and I do not want to go to class. Now you put these two individuals next to each other when they are 30 years old. The child who decided not to become educated, the only thing they can do is combing the beach, because they need to find something under the sand and go and sell it in order to be able to find a piece of bread and eat, buy a piece of bread and eat. However, the PhD who decides to comb the beach is doing it because they are philosophically inclined that they are going to gain something from it. And given the fact that the person has a PhD, probably he understands more than I do. So who am I to judge that? However, I can make a judgment that that individual has the freedom to comb the beach and to go and become to work in NASA, for example, and contribute to the society, make the money that he wants, and have the freedom to do whatever that they want to do. So it is for this reason that Baha'u'llah reminds humanity that the essence of freedom is sheer impotence. This is going to have a lot of head scratching. If you walk away to say, yes, I understand what he's talking about, think twice. We really need to think about this in order to understand what he's talking about here, that what it is that is sheer impotence. However, I give you one example. The most powerful people are those who have the power to be able to do something positive for themselves and for the rest of people. However, the powerful person also has the right and has the capability, has the right in his own mind or in her own mind, and has the capability to be able to overpower other people and enslave them, right? So look at the difference of freedom that these two individuals that I have discussed, and they fall on two different sides of the spectrum here. And now within that context, try to understand what the concept of impotence is. To give you one example of this, I can probably explore the statement that Abdul Baha makes. There are a lot of the prayers and a lot of writings he has where he's placing himself and his station. He says that my highest station is to be at the footsteps or underneath the footsteps of other Baha'is. Yet when we look at him, we will see that he was a spiritual giant, right? Naturally, the question comes up, why? Why would someone who is a giant places himself at such a low point? And the answer to this is very simple. Once again, I'm going to provide the answer. However, I want you to do your own research. In the realm of physics, there are two different forms of energy. There is one form called potential energy. The other one is the kinetic energy. Potential energy has to do with the ability. It's the power that drives everything. In potential energy, it is the distance that you place yourself relative to another point. So, for example, when Abdul Baha is talking about placing himself beneath the footsteps of the other Baha'i friends, basically he is saying is if Baha'u'llah is the apex or is the utmost point where I am looking at, now by placing myself at the lowest possible position relative to where he is, I am maximizing the potential energy, right? So if he was to place himself at a position of authority, right, then the delta between the position where Baha'u'llah is and where he is so little, so that naturally the potential energy is going to be very low. Freedom is one of those concepts as well. You are at the maximum position relative to freedom when you place yourself at the lowest position relative to all other beings. We are social beings. We are living in a world where a lot of other people are living. Now, if I am going to place myself exactly at the same position as everybody else, now you've got a lot of competing individuals, and nothing but war is going to happen, nothing but what we see today. When we try to place ourselves at a lower position, and that is the sheer impotence that Baha'u'llah is talking about, that is where freedom is going to manifest itself to the greatest extent. Because now you have a world where people are going to consider others before they consider themselves. I constantly come out of this. So I couldn't prevent myself from putting this in here. I think this is a very important thing because it's a reality of the life that we are living in. Whether we consider ourselves free or not, considering different types of freedoms that we have talked about, at the end of the day, we are in either one of these two cages. Either we are in a very rusty cage where we can see the rust and we can see all these metal bars around us, and we hate every minute of being in there, or we can find ourselves in a cage like this where we can sit in there and praise it and say, this is such a wonderful thing. I love it. Or these walls are so far away from my eyes that I don't even see it, that I'm inside of a cage. To give you one example here, to make it very clear, we have two fundamental systems of economy in the world that I'm going to give you an example. Once again, this is a philosophical discussion. It's not a political discussion. So as a result, I do not want to, for people to take this to its political implications, even though it does have political implications. This rusty cage that you see, for example, this is what happens to humanity when the notion of communism was introduced in the world. People were put into a cage and all the freedoms were taken away from them, and they could see these rusty bars, and they hated every minute of it. The other system, on the other hand, is the free systems that we live in. These free systems are still a cage. We are free to do whatever we want. However, by our own inadequacies, by our own intentions, we enter into this cage of living beyond our means by doing things that do not really match that which is within our capabilities. We are going to put ourselves inside of a cage where we enjoy it. Nevertheless, it cages us throughout our entire life. For example, consider a person who has 20 different credit cards and they live month by month after and paying the money that they did not have and they spend off of their credit cards, right? So they are inside of a beautiful cage like this. They spend all the money they want. However, at the end of the day, they are stuck with all the money that they have to give back. Now, I'm not going to go through all these explanations that I've given here. However, the colors match these different things. And as you can see, there are some relationships, and I have attempted to capture it through by the notion of the colors. I constantly come out of the presentation mode. Okay, the best way to exercising of freedom in one's life. The name of the game is to be able to explore moderation. I try to capture the idea by this. We are an ice cream nation. Everybody loves ice cream. Now the question is, how much ice cream, how much sweets are we going to have? And I don't need to tell you that the size of this ice cream is the name of the game, basically. Sometimes you go to places that they give you an ice cream that you wonder, how could a person eat? There is so much of it there. So freedom is very as sweet as this ice cream, but the question is how much of it is too little and how much of it is too much. So according to Baha'i writings, moderation is extremely important as we apply it to this concept of freedom. And actually, moderation should be applied to every aspect of human life, including freedom. It's not just freedom. Baha'u'llah states, consider such things as liberty, civilization, and the like. However much men of understanding may favorably regard them, they will, if carried to excess, exercise a pernicious influence upon men. And Abdul-Baha likewise refers to the notion of moderate freedom, which guarantees the welfare of the world of mankind and maintains and preserves the universal relationships. As to how to achieve this, Baha'u'llah is telling us that mankind in its entirety must firmly adhere to whatsoever has been revealed and vouchsafed unto it. Then and only then will it attain unto true liberty and give ear unto that which, if heeded, will ensure the freedom well-being and tranquility, exaltation and advancement of all men. So you remember that concept of education that I talked about, I alluded to in the introductory remarks? That is basically what he is referring to. In the writings of Baha'u'llah, there is an immense amount of education in regards to the concept of freedom and liberty. And that is where we need to start exploring the concept in order to have a better understanding of what it is. And please remember that moderation is the name of the game. Freedom is intimately tied to our actions. There are basically two aspects to freedom. There are external and internal factors. I presented it as the yin and yang. A lot of people are familiar with this concept. You might not be. However, at the most fundamental level, yin and yang refer to the covert and the overt aspects of life. So the external factors or the physical dimension is going to be the overt aspect, and the dark one is going to be the covert section. The problem is really with the yin portion of the equation here, because it appears that we are paying some attention to this aspect, and there are some aspects of this that we are completely overlooking. So the two aspects of freedom are complementary to one another. As I mentioned, to yin and yang. It is possible to be aware of the external influencer without understanding the internal one, or vice versa. And in both cases, there is something that is not going to be balanced about it, and we are not going to be able to exercise freedom in its correct way. According to Abdul Baha, attainment to any object is conditioned upon knowledge and volition, and as well as action. Unless these three conditions are forthcoming, there is no execution or accomplishment. So one point I want to take you back to is that in the beginning, I referred to the idea that action is intimately tied to freedom. When we are talking about freedom, it is really freedom to act on something. It is the freedom of a speech. A speech is a type of action. Freedom to be able to do what you want. Nevertheless, they enslave you and they take that away from you. So that is something that is, again, related to action and so on and so forth. So please note that volition is an absolute commitment in achieving something, and it's the most powerful force in human behavior. This is something that we really need to consider. As free people, who do we end up with to be is going to be depending on these three factors: knowledge, volition, and action. And action turns out to be the fruit of human freedom. So given the fact that knowledge plays a very important role, I felt that I need to share with you this particular saying. This particular saying that the poetry that I'm going to read is attributed to Rumi. There are other people that this thing has been attributed to also. So the poem goes as follows. I'm not going to read the Farsi. The Persian participants could do that. However, the poem goes as follows: that he who knows and knows that he knows is wise. Follow him. He who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep. Wake him. He who knows not and knows that he knows not is a student. Teach him. He who knows not and knows not that he knows not is a fool. Shun him. So each one of these couplets, and the couplet is the two lines, and these are the two lines that we are referring to here, refers to a particular station according to a Baha'i view. So the first one, he who knows and knows that he knows, represents the station of the manifestation of God. the concept of he who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep. That represents the station of the lower prophets. These are people such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah, and so on and so forth. The third one, he who knows and knows not, and knows that he knows not, is a student, is the station, apex of human understanding. And the last one, he who knows not and knows not that he knows not, depicts the station of human ignorance. Please remember this. This is going to become very important in the next pages. I am not going to walk you through this entire page. It appears to me that philosophers have a lot of time on their hand to repeat the same concept in different ways. So, for example, these I have presented these in two different colors here because number one, the definition offered in number 1, number 3, and number 5, basically similar, and the definition in number 2, 4, and 6 are basically similar. However, we don't want to get into this. I'm going to give you a simple example, and I want you to understand this. Probably you can walk away with more out of this example than anything else. Let's consider salt. We use this on a daily basis. You and I can go around and read a lot of books about salt. We can write a lot of books about salt as well. We can write a thesis about it. There is one thing that we are not going to be able to do by the virtue of studying, and that is the taste of the salt. The only way to obtain the taste of the salt is to taste it. You really need to taste it. The same thing is true about knowledge. There are some forms of knowledge that you need to taste it. There are some forms of knowledge that you need to go and study about it. I'm going to bring about a very important statement that is made by Baha'u'llah in the first verse of the Kitab Aqdas, that he identifies that as a duty for the entire human race. And the duty is identified as recognizing him. I'm not going to go through the entire quotation. However, he says that it's incumbent upon everyone to recognize who he is. In the context of the example that we are giving here, this recognition is the concept of tasting. So as Baha'is, you need to think about it, that how are you going to allow others to be able to take a taste of the teachings of Baha'u'llah? In majority of cases, we take the books and we give it to the other people and say, read it and learn about Baha'u'llah. But that is all the books that are written about the salt. How are you going to allow other people to taste? When you introduce a friend to another individual, you're not going to give them information about that you can find in books. You are going to tell them about what kind of a person he is, how good of a friend he is, what he has done for you that made him a friend, right? This is the taste that you are conveying. Now, these various forms of knowledge that we are talking about here is the difference between that which we can study versus that which we can taste. In some other areas where basically you are going to come across the same concept as objective form of knowledge and subjective form of knowledge. Tasting is a subjective form of knowledge, and studying is an objective form of knowledge. So how do we obtain knowledge? We can obtain knowledge through observation, we can obtain it through information, and we can obtain it through detailed evaluation. So what is observation? For example, I hear something, see something, it's an outcome of an event. You read a newspaper, you read an article, or you watch TV. It's a simple process, and you come across some information. Now, if you take whatever you have observed and whatever you have been informed about, and you do detailed evaluation of these various pieces of information and the various pieces of observation or data, the final product is going to be a systematic process, the outcome of which is knowledge. This knowledge is going to require a lot of effort. Now, if I'm going to superimpose this on theoretical knowledge versus experiential knowledge, these are the two different forms of knowledge that we talked about, presented in different colors. We have to gather information, we have to cross-correlate the data, we have to conduct fact check, we have to contemplate, and then we have to recognize what the final meaning is. In the form of experiential knowledge, which is subjective, it is related to the individuals, knowing the best practices, living through it, and having the experience and having the wisdom or insight about it. But in both cases, you see, you need to go through a lot of effort in order to obtain the information, obtain the knowledge. According to Aristotle, be a free thinker and don't accept everything you hear as a truth. What is it that you're hearing? What you're hearing is basically is a very simple observation. He says, don't pay attention to observations. Be critical and evaluate what you believe in. So that means take observation and information, send it through an evaluation in order to come up with knowledge. This gentleman knew what he was talking about. Pay attention to what he says. Now, I'm gonna share with you something that happens, which is extremely sad. We are in election season. TV provides you with all sorts of bits and pieces of information, bits and pieces of data, all sorts of hearsay, and opinions of people are swayed based on observation and based on information. And they walk into election booths and they elect, and they feel that they have exercised their freedom. How far from it? How far from it? How far from it? Think about it. Neither observation nor information is actionable. Only knowledge is actionable. How many people are going through that process? And yet we vote based on observation and information. And then we scratch our head, what went wrong? So schematically presented, observation has to go through evaluation in order to be turned into information. Information has to go through contemplation in order to turn into knowledge. And that knowledge through experience and intuition is going to turn into wisdom. One thing that you should walk away with this: these two are effortless. It is very simple to just sit down and watch TV and consider themselves, or go through whatever comes up on the internet and think that I'm knowledgeable. But no, you're not knowledgeable. You're informed. You have gained some data. This is an effortless process. You're expanding the least amount of work necessary in order to obtain that which you're calling knowledge. But this is pseudo knowledge. Knowledge as a rare asset in our society. So basically, observation, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Consider these example: raw material, fast food, cooked food, healthy eating. Example number 2, food, glue, and a screw, loose fit table, finished table, a decorated table. I think you get the idea. And I really don't need to go through more details here. We have another problem here. We live in an information age. Everybody are just basically pride themselves of living in an information age. This could be a blessing, or it could be the worst disease that is afflicting our society. So what is information age? It refers to the period after the industrial age. It is a period that basically started from the 1980s. It is an age that corresponds to the increase in production, transmission, and consumption of information. This information is widely available through media and networks. Internet is arguably the most prominent innovation of the information age, and the information age has impacted every aspect of human life, our technology, science, economies, culture, the way we think, and the way we are doing things. I felt that this picture really captures it. Sometimes we feel that these bits and pieces of information are just rotating around our head. This is wonderful. However, there is a problem. I want you to think it is a blessing to be in the information age. However, if you're blindly approaching it, then that blessing could be a curse. Consider the fundamental difference between knowledge and information. You really need to understand that when you're dealing with information age. When you understand that, then you're in a good position to benefit from information age. Ponder on the question of actionability we associate with knowledge. If people remember that information is not actionable, observation is not actionable, society is going to be in a much better position than it is today. Reflect on human preference to settle for information that is easier to obtain, that knowledge which must be synthesized. This is the path of least resistance. Everybody wants to settle for that. It's much easier. If I can become knowledgeable by the virtue of spending the least amount of time, why should I go and spend the amount of time to become, to synthesize things? So contemplate on the implication of living in an environment flooded with information. The actions we are bound to take based on information rather than knowledge, the wrong decisions we are bound to make as a result of this. This is I found this to be a very meaningful depiction, because basically through that which comes out of TV and the fact that we react to information and raw data, people can use that in order to sway the way we think. And that is dangerous in a free society. Another problem to consider, worlds of knowledge. Etymologically, when we refer to knowledge, the terms knowledge and the world are related to each other. And the roots of this goes back to the Arabic language. In Arabic language, the term ilm is at its root related to the word alam, for the world. Alam means world and ilm means knowledge. So in reality, world is the place that we live in that has a particular level of knowledge associated with it, and vice versa. Ilm is that which proceeds from the world that which we decide to live in. Okay? So knowledge of a child is tied to the world of childhood. Knowledge of a streetwise is tied to the experiential world. Knowledge of a doctor tied to the world of medicine. Knowledge of a philosopher is tied to the philosophical world. Examples of this can be given to ad nauseum. So I can just sit here and for the next hour to give you different examples of this. As one advances from a lower level of knowledge into a higher level of knowledge, it is as if one has advanced from a lower world into a higher one. And one characteristic of this is that one residing in a higher world of knowledge or greater state of knowledge would be cognizant of that which defines knowledge in a lower world. However, this is a one-way street. It's like a diode in electronics. It is not a two-way street, it's a one-way street. This property of knowledge makes the realm of existence, makes the realm of existence a multi-dimensional world where every human being possesses the same physical existence, yet resides in a different non-physical world. This is an extremely important statement because we live 7.6 billion people resides on Earth. However, they live in distinct worlds of knowledge and they have different worldviews. And as a result, they cannot see the same thing that the other person sees. So these worlds that we are talking about, these non-physical worlds that we are talking about, has been referred to as the inner world, spiritual world, intellectual world, and so on and so forth. For this reason, although people live together in a society, but remain worlds apart. And in this context, angels and devils are ordinary people that they live together, and they do not need to be supernatural entities. These are beings that live in different worlds. Realities for them are different. As a result, they behave in different ways. So I have depicted this in the form of an onion here. So as you can see, is that this is the world of the fetus. You might say, what kind of a world of knowledge a fetus could have? A fetus has the world of the matrix, the world of the mother. That's the womb of the mother represents the world where the fetus resides in. The fetus is aware of the voices, the sounds that he or she hears, and also is aware of some measure of light that could pass through the skin of the belly of the mother. But it is a very limited world. And that same fetus, when it's born into this world, enters new arenas where the worlds of knowledge become available to him or to her at different levels. So as a result, the world of the toddler becomes separate from the world of a primary schooler, high schooler, street smart, college graduate, world of work experience, world of knowledge, and world of wisdom. I can put many other titles here. However, I thought that this would capture the thought for you. We also have a world of ignorance. World of ignorance could be something that could appear at any one of these layers. It represents a conscious or subconscious decision to disregard the reality of the situation and react according to one's base desires. This could happen at any of these layers cited above. So now the question becomes, can we rely on common sense? What is common sense? Common sense is basically defined as the sound judgment considering everyday matters. However, the origin of this comes from Aristotle. Basically, the concept was attributed to the various senses that animals and human beings have. And hold on a second. That animals and human beings have. And according to Aristotle, basically, we can all agree based on that which all the senses convey to us, and we can call that common sense. A lot of people believe that humanity could achieve agreement based on common sense. However, Abdu'l-Baha argues against the reliability of common sense. He says that, but in the estimation of the divine philosophers, the proof and assurances are not reliable. Nay, rather, they deem the standard of the senses to be false because it's imperfect. And then he gives an example. He says, sight, for instance, is one of the most important of the senses. Yes, it is subject to many aberrations and inaccuracies. Because we see the mirage as a body of water and regard images in the mirrors as realities. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing here. So how do we overcome the challenges associated with knowledge? We are constantly bombarded with unusable data and information. Transforming this into actionable knowledge is a time-consuming process. Not many care to spend so much effort on knowledge or everyday decision making. Abdu'l-Baha offers an easy yet effective and universally applicable method for knowledge-based decision making. Anyone, regardless of their level of education, can use this method and benefit from it. And this is the one that I want you to take away from this entire presentation. If you take away this, that means that you are going to have something that you can use in your life in a very positive sense. It applies to those who want to buy a car. It applies to those who want to get married. It applies to those who want to vote. It applies to those who want to go and make a decision in regards to doing something critical in their life. Applies across the world to everything. He states the 4 criteria or standards of judgment, which he refers to down here, by which the human mind reaches its conclusion are faulty and inaccurate. All of them are liable to mistake and error in conclusions, but a statement presented to the mind accompanied by the proofs which the senses can perceive, so it is common sense can agree to it, which the faculty of reason can accept, the rational method can accept it, which is in accord with traditional authority, your moral beliefs. It doesn't matter whether you are a Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Jew, or whoever else. That has a feedback into that which you observe, that information you have received, and sanctioned by the promptings of the heart. This is the gut feelings. This is your sense of inspiration. Can be adjudged and relied upon as perfectly correct, for it has been proved and tested by all the standards of judgment and found to be complete. When you apply but one test, there are possibilities of mistake. This is self-evident and manifest. Please understand that the methodology that Abdu'l-Baha is offering could be applied by a high schooler, could be applied by a professor of a university, it could be applied by a simple working person who does not have much of an education, and it could be applied by a philosopher. It has within it the ability to provide the individuals with the necessary set of criteria to make the right judgment. And one other comment about this, the first 2 criteria are the foundation of science. Science is based on observation and intellectual modeling or intellectual thought superimposed on the 2. And that's why science has been so successful. Abdu'l-Baha superimposes a moral dimension on the top of this. So as you can see, from a Baha'i point of view, decision-making process is a very rigorous process and is far more rigorous than the scientific methodology that is being used. I highly recommend it. It is very meaningful. In conclusion, realizing that freedom does not have a static definition, it's a dynamic one. Recognizing that freedom is a relative phenomenon, understanding that freedom becomes more restrictive as we go from world of one to world of many, appreciating the fact that there is a subjective understanding of freedom, and we really need to make that more objective across the masses because we live in a society. Knowing the need for a systematic education of freedom in order to overcome deep divides in our society. At this point, there is a very, very inadequate educational system in place to teach this. Comprehend the fruit of freedom as action, realizing that action is tied to that which one understands, recognize that one can understand based on observation, information, knowledge, or wisdom, understanding that observation and information do not provide enough understanding to act upon. This is extremely important to remember. Comprehending that only knowledge and wisdom are actionable and very few act according to these. Realizing that one's knowledge defines the world one resides in. It provides our worldview. Recognizing the invisible barriers that separates these worldviews and keep peoples apart. Understanding that common sense cannot be a robust criterion of judgment. and begin to use this simple and robust method that was provided by Abdul Baha to look at all issues from a knowledge-based point of view. I would like to end this presentation by looking to a bright future. There are some quotations from Abdul Baha when he came to United States in 1912. So basically in Washington, D.C., he said, truly, this is a great and revered nation, referring to the American nation. Here, liberty has reached its highest degree. The intentions of its people are most praiseworthy. They are indeed worthy of being the first to build the tabernacle of the most great peace and proclaim the oneness of mankind. He repeated the same thing a few months later. He said, praise be to God, the standard of liberty is held aloft. In this land, you enjoy political liberty, you enjoy liberty of thought, speech, religious liberty, racial and personal liberty. And also he referred to he says that may this American democracy be the first nation to establish the foundation of international agreements. May it be the first nation to proclaim the universality of mankind. May it be the first to upraise the standard of the most great peace. And finally, let this American democracy become glorious in spiritual degrees, even as it has aspired to material degrees, and render this just government victorious. Confirm this revered nation to upraise the standards of the oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become hereby most glorious and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. This concludes my presentation for today. If there are any questions, and please accept my apologies for the long presentation.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that you took the time to go through this presentation. And for all of you watching, if you saw the numbers at the end of the quotations, these are references so you can, in looking at the presentation, find the sources yourself. There is a question, and Mr. Alex Boyson from Norway has this question for you.
Yes.
I'm going to read it. So in reference to your slide 15 of 32, the quote that you mentioned from Abdul Baha, he asks, what do you understand as the benefits of freedom, as you quoted Abdul Baha as being the greatest blessing? Abdul Baha, we know, found great blessing in being a prisoner in the path of his love.
Right.
So that is his question.
Okay. So basically, Abdul Baha is teaching, in my opinion, Abdul Baha is teaching a couple of things here. Number one, for us to understand freedom, which is a positive attribute, we also need to understand the opposite of that. So he is providing that by the virtue of example. He says, look at me, I understand what the value of freedom is because I was incarcerated for a long period of time. So the value of freedom is extremely important. So overall, freedom is very important to human life because the answer goes back to the various kingdoms that I explained before. If you look across various kingdoms, you will see that the notion of freedom is a part and parcel of every aspect of existence. Without freedom, life cannot really manifest itself to its fullest extent. However, when we get to the human world, due to the fact that human beings have the ability to impose their volition and their desire, and they come up with that which they want, then the door becomes wide open in order to abuse that which exists. So as a result, we enslave others, We prevent others from expressing their views. We stop other people who have different colors or different ethnicities and so on and so forth. So Abdul Baha's wish, in my point of view, is that we manifest the freedom that comes with the natural phenomenon of life and be able to express it in its variety throughout existence in the human kingdom, because then and only then we are going to be able to benefit from that which he has to offer. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's the way I'm looking at it.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So there is one last question, unless we're going to have any other emergency questions come up. But there's one last question. And this question is, I would call a action component to not just, of course, researching the material that we've just seen, but in terms of wisdom, if you will. When and if we come into a situation, which is more often than not nowadays, as people are more polarized in their viewpoints when it comes, at least in America, to certain subjects. For someone who would consider themselves not moderate, but one who's searching after truth and is willing to ask questions that, for example, depending on the motive of the listener or the person that there's a participant in the conversation, it may be off of out of bounds to ask certain questions, because again, we talked about getting to knowledge, but to get to knowledge, you have to have observations and you have to gather information. So for someone who's gathering information, who asks questions that may not be considered appropriate at first start, how do you, as a person with wisdom being applied to this context of the world and the people around us who may get hurt simply by one asking a question, how do you propose, in contemplation of others and their reactions, we go as rational, as reasonable, as inquisitive people, conducting these scenarios with our friends, our loved ones, and strangers?
So how do we say something to other people in order to gather more information necessary in order to synthesize knowledge without them getting upset about what we're asking?
Yes.
That's indeed a very good question, and I'm going to give you a story in order to answer that question. There are different ways of saying the same thing. One of the old kings, they say he had a dream that all his teeth had fallen. So naturally, he asks the soothsayers to come in and give an interpretation of his dream. So the first soothsayer comes in and says that, Your Majesty, the fact that all your teeth have fallen indicates that all your family members are going to die before you die. So get what happened. His Majesty did not like the statement, so his head was chopped off because he said that which was not acceptable. So they asked the second soothsayer to come in, and he raises the same question. He says, I had all my teeth fall off in a dream, so I want to see what is the meaning of that. The second soothsayer says, Your Majesty, you will outlive the rest of your family. And he received a big bag of gold for that which he said. So you can ask the same thing in two different ways and be able to gain the information without offending people. Just to let you know, to give you one example, the presentation that I gave, there are many circles that are extremely sensitive in regards to that which you say about freedom. And I had to spend a lot of time in order to make sure that the context of the material is set up in such a way that it is not going to offend people, because there are things there that a lot of people might not like to hear, depending on what their background is and what their tendencies are. I'm not suggesting that they're wrong in what they say, but however, that's the way life is. People view life in different ways. So the question is, how do you say something in order for everyone to be able to benefit from it? And there are cases where just simply it's going to be hard to say something, and that's why sometimes you need to sugarcoat that which you say in order for the bitter medicine to be swallowed. So anyway, that's the way I would approach it.
That is very valuable advice, something that a lot of people can stand to listen to, because we're living in an age where increasingly silence is becoming the only solution that people may have to the questions that they have, rather than actually asking them in a way that is, as we just put it, innovative. And yes, it may involve sugarcoating, but it at least will send us in a more progressive direction than one that is still in static.
That is correct. That is correct. But the path that Abdul-Baha recommended, the 4 criteria of judgment, I mean, considering the fact that we live in an information age, I think various forms of media, internet, and so on and so forth, it makes it much easier to apply the 4 criteria of judgment, as long as we're willing to do. Because that way you are not spending exorbitant amount of time in order to gain the knowledge, and you're using a basic approach which is very solid, and you can still come up with very good answers, right? Without becoming a learned in various topics. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, if you are going to become a learned about every possible topic, you're not going to live a life. You're going to be constantly studying and contemplating. And that means you better go to the mountains and inside the cave and just have an internet, with connecting with the outside world. That is not what life is supposed to be all about. That's why I think the 4 criteria of judgment that Abdul-Baha is suggesting extremely useful for everybody to use.
Thank you so much for your time. We all appreciate it, with the program that you're able to set for us today, the very, very fluid, from the question to the answer form. And for everyone watching now, please remember we have this presentation will be posting online, so you can access and use this yourself. This was a beautiful presentation. Jeremiah brought up the concept of having this as a multi-part series. So if you'd be considering that, we definitely would welcome you to do that, because this is a very valuable subject, especially nowadays. That being said, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We are having a program weekly, Baha'i explorations with the Clearwater Baha'is. Just go to www.clearwaterbaha'is.org. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you.